إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستغفره ونستعين به ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم أرسله الله بشيرًا ونذيرًا خاتم النبيين ورحمة للعالمين. All praise belongs to Allah. We seek His guidance and forgiveness. We depend on Him. We seek refuge in Allah from the ills of our souls. Whomsoever Allah guides, he will not be astray, and whomsoever Allah leaves astray, he will not be guided. Bear witness there is none worthy of worship except for Allah, and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent as a final messenger, a bearer of glad tidings, and a warner, and a mercy for all of creation. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. O you who believe, fear Allah, be conscious of Allah, and don't die except in a state of Islam. قال الله سبحانه وتعالى أعوذ بالله بعد أن أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ahzab, ayah 23, from the believers, from Allah, among the believers, there are those who are truthful to their pledge to Allah. And some of them have fulfilled this pledge, and some of them are waiting for their turn, and they didn't change the pledge. That means they stayed true to whatever the pledge was, and they didn't go back on it. You know, subhanAllah, when you read the Qur'an and you read these ayat, you just get through it really quickly until you try to find out what's the meaning behind it. Why did it come down? When did it come down? And then suddenly the Qur'an becomes alive. So, on the day of the Battle of Uhud, and just to give you context, the Battle of Uhud was on the third year after the Hijrah, after the Prophet ﷺ and the believers from Mecca went to Medina. This was the second major battle after Badr. Meaning Badr was the first major battle where the Quraysh was defeated. And Quraysh could not believe that they were defeated by these Muslims who came out of nowhere, and suddenly they're defeating them. And they had a lot of arrogance, and they had a lot of vengeance, and they wanted revenge. So they've put all their money together and all their men, and they prepared for a long time to battle the Muslims. And their thought was, we're going to wipe these people out of the face of the earth. Have you heard that before? And subhanAllah, the Qur'an comes alive even in today's world. So their goal of Uhud was to really kill the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and end the Muslims once and for all. Of course, the Muslims prepared for them as well, and strategically from where to hold the battle itself. And so there was a lot of stuff that went into it. And I don't want to talk about Uhud a lot because it's not really the purpose of today's khutbah, but the Muslims initially defeated the Quraysh, but eventually there were some mistakes that were made, and Quraysh came back and they pretty much slaughtered a lot of believers that were on the ground, the battleground. And so the person who was holding the flag for the believers, the flag bearer on that day, his name was Mus'ab ibn Umair. And to be a flag bearer is a huge honor. Not everybody gets that chance. And it also turns out that Mus'ab ibn Umair, radiallahu anhu, was also the flag bearer on the day of Badr. So the Prophet ﷺ gave him that opportunity twice because of his position. So Mus'ab ibn Umair, when he saw the mushrikeen or the Quraysh people come in and basically mowing down the believers on the battleground, and a lot of believers, basically they put their swords down and they were collecting the bounty from the ground. And so they were surprised. They didn't expect someone to come back. And of course, Quraysh's goal was to kill the Prophet ﷺ. And he knew that at some point they were going to get to him if they continued in their path. And so Mus'ab ibn Umair, he was on a horse, and he basically said, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. He went in a different direction from the battleground so that he could distract the Quraysh away from the Prophet ﷺ. And he was placed. And he was basically trying to buy maybe 3 or 5 minutes for the Prophet ﷺ so that he could get into a safety. Of course, Mus'ab ibn Umair was by himself, and he fought as much as he can, and they killed him. May Allah have mercy on him. And so at the end of the day, when the battle ended, and the Prophet ﷺ, his usual thing was to go and check all of the people that were martyred. And he saw Hamza radiallahu anhu, his uncle, and he wept very hard. He was very emotional. And then he saw Mus'ab ibn Umair radiallahu anhu. And he cried. He cried a lot. And that's when he read the ayat that I read earlier, مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ رِجَالٌ صَدَقُوا مَا عَاهَدُوا اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ قَضَى نَحْبَهُ. There are people who fulfilled their pledge, and that he was referring to Mus'ab. Meaning, Mus'ab made a pledge to Allah that he was going to be doing whatever Allah has asked him to do. Some scholars say this was referring to a few ayat before that says, if you're in a battle, don't run away from the battle. Right, so Mus'ab did fulfill that, but some scholars say this is overall in Islam. When you become a Muslim, you're making a pledge to Allah that you will fulfill all of His commands and also avoid all of the things that He prohibited. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Mus'ab is among those who fulfilled his pledge, and there are those who are waiting for their turn, meaning eventually some people will also be martyred in future battles. Now, I'm going to be like Hollywood here. I'm going to say 13 years before in Mecca. And I want to tell you about Mus'ab because it's important. Mus'ab ibn Umair, he was from the people of Quraysh. He was from a small tribe. And they were extremely wealthy. Like their wealth was vast. And his father has passed away before he was even a teenager. And he had 2 other siblings from the father's side, but he was the only child for his mother. And the mother loved him, and she spoiled him like abundantly. And the wealth that his father left for him was equivalent to half of the wealth of Mecca. Half of the wealth of Mecca. That was all his that he inherited. He was known as a trendsetter. He was wearing the best clothes. He was wearing the best perfume. He was eloquent. He was educated. He was the elite of the elite. And he was 11 to 12 years old. So 13 years before this day of the battle where he got murdered, he was about 11 to 12 years old. He had everything. Influential, anything you can think of. And he heard about Islam and the messenger. And so he looked into it. And he found the house where they were gathering to learn. It was called the Darul Arqam. And he just went there and knocked on the door. They let him in. They didn't see a threat from him, so they let him in. He sat in the back, and the Prophet ﷺ was actually giving a lecture at that time. He was doing some teaching. And the Prophet didn't stop, ﷺ. He continued. And once he finished, he went to the Prophet ﷺ and asked a few things about the religion. And he accepted Islam. He was only 11 to 12 years old at that time. And the Prophet ﷺ told him, do not reveal your Islam, because they were still hiding at that time their religion. And so he continued to hide his religion even at home, and he would pray in hiding and so on. But eventually, his mom found out. And she was heartbroken. And she asked him to give up the religion or else. And he said no. So he was imprisoned in his house. But he was obedient to his mother. He could have fought, but he didn't want to fight. He was obedient to his mother. He just stayed in his house. He was basically imprisoned in the house. And a few years actually has passed, and he found out that there were some believers who were going to migrate to Abyssinia, to the Ethiopia area. And he escaped and he went with them. And he stayed there for a few years, and then eventually there was some rumors that Quraysh had become Muslim, which was not true, and he came back with some believers, even though a few of them stayed behind, but he came back. And on the day he came back, he actually went to see the Prophet right away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he went to see his mom. And his mom was actually upset. She said, "You come to town and you don't come see me first. Instead, you go to see the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam." And he said, "Oh, Mom, you brought me into this world, but the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took me out of darkness into light. And my love for the Prophet is greater than yours." And that is in line with the teaching of the Prophet ﷺ, and what Allah tells us, that we have to love Allah and the Prophet more than we love ourselves and anybody else. There's nothing that's unusual from that sentence. And so she tried to plead with him to leave the religion. He said no. And she said, I'm going to imprison you again. But he said, not this time. He said, anyone you bring to try to imprison me, I'm going to kill him. So I'm not going to stand down anymore. So she realized that he was serious about it, and they parted their way. And then she said, you cannot take a penny from your wealth. You have to leave it behind. He said, that's fine. I don't care about it. So imagine what he's given up for Islam, for the religion. A wealth. Now think about it. Why did all the Quraysh fight with the Prophet ﷺ? Because they were worried about their money. They were worried about their future income. And his wealth was half of their wealth, all of it together. And he gave it up, just like that. He said, I don't want any of it. So we will be faced with sacrifices for the religion. Some of us have already faced it. Some of us will be faced in the future. And you have to think about what's more important. Now, I don't expect everybody to give up like that much wealth on this day and age. Our iman is not that strong, including myself. But there are many opportunities that come our way, and I'm not talking about charity, by the way. I'm talking about opportunities come for us to do good deeds for the sake of Allah. And some of us are afraid to do it because of a potential future loss if we did this. And I don't want to get into the details, but some example of what's happening in Palestine. If you're vocal, your word, you're going to lose your job, for example. Just to give you a small example. Everybody's iman is at a different place. I don't expect everybody to be the same. But in order for us to practice sacrifice for the sake of Allah, I want us to start in a small place. And that is waking up for Fajr in the morning. You're giving up a small few hours or maybe 1 hour of your sleep. Pray Fajr and go back to sleep if you want. But that's a sacrifice you're making. And then at least a few times a month or once a month, stay up until sunrise, so that you can get the ajr of a hajj. Why I say this is because Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, a great leader at one point, who wanted to fight the Crusaders and kick them out of Palestine, he used to say, we will be ready for battle when the mosques in the Fajr time are filled in the same amount of people that fill the mosque on Jummah day. So that was his measurement of readiness. If people are filling the mosques at Fajr time, the same number of people, or similar, not exactly the same, but similar to the amount of people fill the mosque on the day of Jummah, then we're ready for battle. And they were asked, why did you use this as a measurement? And he said, I cannot ask someone to sacrifice their life if they're not willing to sacrifice their sleep. Very visionary person. And it's true. If you're not willing to sacrifice your sleep, you're not going to sacrifice anything for that matter, because this is part of the 5 prayers. So I'm not saying to sacrifice anything at this point. I'm just saying as a practice for us to start sacrificing for the sake of Allah, because we will be faced with a situation where we have to sacrifice something. That's this religion, the way it is. And if you don't practice that, it will be difficult for you to make that decision. And so if you start with the sleep at least, and then move on to qiyam, where you sacrifice more sleep, eventually you'll be ready to sacrifice more than that, inshallah. And when you're faced with these situations where you have to give up something, and sometimes it's all in our head. We think that we have to give up something in the future. We may lose something in the future. And I want to ask you something, to remind yourself this thing before you decide not to do a good deed because of a potential future loss. You are not guaranteed to live tomorrow. So you're worried about a future loss that you may not even be there. Yet if you were to do that good deed and you were to pass away tonight, you would collect all that ajr. It's something to give it a thought. Now, I'm not going to tell you all these things. I want to share a beautiful hadith. Some of you have already known it. The Prophet ﷺ said, as narrated by Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, احفظ الله يحفظك احفظ الله تجدك تجاهك إذا سألت فاسأل الله وإذا استعنت فاستعن بالله واعلم أن الأمة لو اجتمعت على أن ينفعوك بشيء لم ينفعوك إلا بشيء قد كتبه الله لك وإن اجتمعوا على أن يضروك بشيء لم يضروك بشيء إلا بشيء قد كتبه الله عليك رفعت الأقلام وجفت الصحف. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I'm going to skip a few things because that's not really the purpose of today's khutbah. And he said, remember that if all the people gather to benefit you, they will not be able to benefit you except that which Allah had ordained for you, or had written for you. Basically, only Allah can benefit you, or only Allah can harm you. So don't worry about a future loss. It's not going to happen if Allah didn't write it for you. And if it happens, it's actually good for you. So let me continue. And if all of them gather to do harm to you, they will not be able to afflict you with anything other than that which Allah had predestined against you. So nobody can help you if Allah has not written for you, with any benefit for that matter, and no one can harm you if Allah has not written it for you. So we may worry about a future loss. If Allah has not written for you, it's not going to happen. And if Allah has written for you, it doesn't matter whether you avoided a good deed or not, it will happen. And the good news about us believers is that anything that happens to us is good for us. Even if it looks bad, even if it's harmful, like if it's physically harmful, it's still good for us. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إن الله غفور رحيم. Bismillah wa salamu ala Rasulillah. I'm going to skip the announcements today because we're a bit short on time. Bismillah wa salamu ala Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Allahumma laka alhamdu ala ni'mat al-Islam wa laka alhamdu ala ni'mat al-Qur'an wa laka alhamdu ala ni'mat al-Habib alayhi salatu wa salam. La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah له الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت وهو على كل شيء قدير. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. اللهم اغفر لنا وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. اللهم اغفر لوالدينا كما ربونا صغيرا. اللهم اشف مرضانا واغفر وارحم موتانا. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان. اللهم صل وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن والاهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. عباد الله، إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم واشكروه يزدكم واستغفروه يغفر لكم.